The gasps reached her before the sight did. Maren felt them ripple through the ballroom like wind through a wheat field, a collective inhale that sucked the warmth from the chandelier light and left everything cold and glittering and sharp. She was standing near the east colonnade, one gloved hand resting on a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, when the doors at the top of the grand staircase opened and her husband walked in with another woman on his arm. Not just any woman. Vivienne Lacourt. Porcelain skin, auburn hair swept into an arrangement that probably took 3 hours and 2 maids, wearing a gown of ivory and gold that was cut so precisely it looked like it had been poured onto her body. She moved the way flame moves, effortless, mesmerizing, destructive. And her hand rested on the Duke of Ashworth's forearm with the casual possessiveness of someone who had been touching him for a very long time. Maren's champagne glass trembled. She set it down on the nearest surface before anyone could see. Around her, the whispers ignited like brush fire. Every fan in the room lifted simultaneously, covering mouths that couldn't wait to speak. She could feel the weight of 300 gazes shifting between her and the staircase, measuring, comparing, and savoring. The Duchess of Ashworth, standing alone by a pillar, watching her husband descend into the most important ball of the season with his mistress displayed like a jewel he'd just acquired. She should leave. Every nerve in her body screamed it. Walk out through the service corridor, find her carriage, go home to the silence of Ashworth House, and pretend this was a dream conjured by too much laudanum and not enough sleep. But Maren Blackford had not survived 3 years of marriage to Cornelius Blackford, the 5th Duke of Ashworth, by running. She had survived by standing still, by becoming stone when the world required her to crumble. So she stood still now, her spine straightened until it ached. Her chin lifted to the angle her mother had drilled into her since childhood. Not defiant, not defeated, perfectly neutral. The angle of a woman who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. Cornelius reached the bottom of the staircase and paused, scanning the room with the lazy authority of a man who owned most of what he surveyed. His eyes found Maren across the ballroom. For one suspended moment, husband and wife regarded each other through the sea of silk and scandal. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his mouth that carried no warmth whatsoever. Then he turned to Vivienne, leaned close to her ear, and said something that made her laugh, a bright, musical sound that carried across the ballroom like a slap delivered in velvet. Maren did not flinch. She would not give him that. She would not give any of them that. But something inside her, something she'd been holding together with willpower and pride, and the quiet stubbornness her father had always called her finest quality, cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, just a small interior fracture, the kind that doesn't show until the whole structure comes down. She became aware of someone standing beside her, a presence she hadn't invited, hadn't noticed arriving. A voice, low and steady, cutting through the noise with surgical precision. "If you'd like to destroy him," the voice said, "I can help you do it without raising your voice or lowering your dignity." Maren turned. The man beside her was tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested he cared nothing for fashion, but understood it completely. His face was angular, almost severe, softened only by a pair of gray eyes that held something she hadn't expected to find in a ballroom full of spectators. Genuine anger. Not at her. For her. "And who?" Maren said, her voice perfectly controlled. "Are you?" "Hadrian Voss," he said, "the Marquess of Dunmore, and currently the only man in this room who isn't enjoying your humiliation." Before she could respond, before she could decide whether this stranger was a threat or an ally, or simply another predator circling wounded prey. The orchestra struck the opening chord of a waltz, and across the ballroom, Cornelius led Vivienne Lecourt onto the floor for the first dance. The dance that belonged, by every rule of society and marriage and basic decency, to his wife. Marin's fractured heart went very, very quiet. But this moment, this catastrophic, public, irreversible moment, didn't begin tonight. It began 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon in April, when the rain was hammering against the windows of Ashworth House, and Marin discovered that the life she'd been enduring was about to become the life she refused to accept. The letter arrived with the afternoon post, tucked between an invitation to Lady Pemberton's garden party and a bill from the milliner that Cornelius would never see, because Marin handled all household accounts now. She handled everything now. The estate correspondence, the staff disputes, the tenants' complaints, the charitable obligations that came with being a duchess. Cornelius had abdicated every responsibilities except spending money and making her miserable, and he excelled at both. She almost didn't open the letter. It bore no seal she recognized, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Small, precise, feminine. But something about it nagged at her. So she slit the envelope with her father's old letter opener and unfolded the single page inside. The words were direct. No pleasantries, no preamble. Your Grace, I write not to cause you pain, but to prevent a greater one. Your husband intends to install Miss Vivienne Lecourt in the property at Wren Lane before the season ends. He has already commissioned renovations and hired staff in her name. The house is 3 streets from your own. I believe you deserve to know, though I cannot reveal how I know it. A concerned observer. Marin read it twice, then a third time. The words didn't change. 3 streets. He was placing his mistress 3 streets from their home, not in some discreet townhouse across London, where distance could provide the thin fiction of propriety. 3 streets. Close enough that Marin might pass the woman on her morning walk. Close enough that the servants would know. Close enough that everyone would know. And that was precisely the point. Cornelius wasn't hiding anymore. He was announcing. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the desk, willing the tremor to stop. She would not cry. She had stopped crying over Cornelius Blackford 18 months ago, the night she'd found the first set of letters in his study, perfumed and explicit, signed with a name she didn't recognize. She'd confronted him then, still naive enough to believe that confrontation led to resolution. He'd laughed. Actually laughed. My dear, he'd said, pouring himself a brandy with the casual ease of a man discussing the weather. Did you genuinely believe this marriage was anything other than a financial arrangement? Your father's debts required my fortune. My title required your family's connections. We've both fulfilled our obligations. What I do beyond that is entirely my affair. She'd stood there in his study, 23 years old, and felt the ground dissolve beneath her. That was 18 months ago. Since then, she'd rebuilt herself piece by piece, assembling a life within the constraints of a marriage that existed only on paper. She managed the household with ruthless competence. She fulfilled her social duties with grace that bordered on performance art. She attended events on Cornelius's arm when required, played the devoted wife when observed, and retreated into solitude the moment the doors closed. It was a life of surfaces, beautiful, polished, utterly hollow. But 3 streets. That changed things. That wasn't indifference. It was provocation. He wanted her to react, to make a scene, to give him grounds for the public sympathy he'd need when he eventually pushed her aside entirely. Poor Cornelius, saddled with an hysterical wife. No wonder he sought comfort elsewhere. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But what would she do? Marin folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the locked drawer, where she kept all the things Cornelius must never find. Her father's last letter, her mother's ring, a small accounting of her own savings, carefully siphoned from the household allowance over 3 years. Then she sat in the fading afternoon light and did what she always did when the world pressed too close. She planned. By the time her lady's maid, Odette, arrived to dress her for dinner, Marin had made 2 decisions. First, she would attend every event of the season without fail. She would be visible, composed, and beyond reproach. She would give Cornelius no excuse, no ammunition, no crack in her armor he could exploit. Second, she needed an ally, not a friend. She had those, though the circle had shrunk considerably as Cornelius's behavior became more public. She needed someone with power, someone society couldn't dismiss, someone who could stand beside her and change the mathematics of her situation simply by being there. She just didn't know yet who that someone would be. The answer, as it turned out, was already waiting. She simply hadn't collided with him yet. The Whitford luncheon was the kind of affair Marin normally endured, rather than enjoyed. 40 guests seated in a conservatory, dripping with hothouse orchids, conversation as carefully arranged as the flowers. She attended because Lady Whitford was one of the few society hostesses who still treated her with genuine warmth rather than pitying condescension, and because Cornelius had told her pointedly that he would not be accompanying her, which meant Vivienne Lecourt was keeping him occupied elsewhere. Fine. She preferred attending alone. She preferred doing most things alone now. She was seated between a retired admiral who talked exclusively about his gout and a young wife whose name she immediately forgot, making polite conversation about absolutely nothing when she noticed the man at the far end of the table watching her. Not watching, studying. The way one studies a painting or a problem, with focused, unhurried attention. It was the eyes she recognized first. Gray, direct, entirely too perceptive. The same eyes that had appeared beside her at the Bancroft ball 3 days ago, belonging to the man who had offered to help her destroy her husband. Hadrian Voss, the Marquis of Dunmore. She had dismissed him that night, politely but firmly. She didn't know him, didn't trust unsolicited offers from strange men, and had no interest in being anyone's project or entertainment. He'd accepted her refusal with a slight bow and disappeared into the crowd, and she'd assumed that was the end of it. Apparently not. After the main course, when the guests drifted into the gardens for air and gossip, he materialized beside her again. He moved quietly for a man of his height, appearing at her elbow like a thought she'd been trying to suppress. "You're following me," Marin said, not looking at him. "I'm attending a luncheon. You happen to also be here. At the opposite end of a table, you spent 40 minutes staring across." "Studying," he corrected. "There's a difference." She almost smiled. Almost. "And what did your study reveal?" "That you're exhausted. That you haven't slept properly in weeks. That you laughed 4 times during the meal, and none of them were real. And that your husband is a fool of such spectacular proportions that future generations will study him as a cautionary tale." The accuracy of every observation hit her like stones thrown with surgical aim. She stopped walking. "What do you want, Lord Dunmore?" "To make you a proposition." He held up a hand before she could object. "Not that kind. Sit down. Please." There was a bench tucked behind a trellis of climbing roses, half hidden from the other guests. Against every instinct, Marin sat. Hadrian settled at the opposite end, maintaining careful distance. "I know what your husband is doing," he said. "The Wren Lane property, the renovations, the staff hired under Miss Lecourt's name. I know because the builder he hired is the same man currently renovating my East Wing, and builders talk when they're being paid handsomely for discretion. It makes them feel important." Marin's stomach clenched. If you've brought me here to deliver gossip I already possess, I've brought you here to offer a solution. His voice was calm, measured, entirely without melodrama. Your husband is going to humiliate you publicly this season, not accidentally, deliberately. He wants you diminished, so that when he eventually seeks a formal separation, society's sympathy falls to him. She knew this. Hearing it spoken aloud made it worse. I can't stop him from being cruel, Hadrian continued. But I can change what his cruelty achieves. If, instead of standing alone while he parades his mistress, you're seen with someone whose social standing equals his. Someone whose attention suggests that you are not the abandoned wife everyone pities, but a woman with choices. Options. Power. Marin stared at him. You're suggesting a performance. I'm suggesting a counter-narrative. You appear publicly with me. At events, at dinners, at the ball. Not as lovers. As something more unsettling to a man like your husband. As equals. As two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Nothing scandalous. Nothing that could be used against you. Just enough to shift the story. From pitiful wife to what exactly? To a woman who isn't waiting for her husband to decide her fate. The breeze carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, absurdly pleasant for a conversation about the strategic destruction of a marriage. Marin studied Hadrian's face, searching for the trap, the angle, the hidden motive that must be lurking beneath this polished offer. Why? She asked. Why would you do this? You don't know me. You have nothing to gain. Something shifted in his expression. The composed mask slipped, just for a moment, revealing something raw underneath. I have my own reasons for wanting your husband publicly diminished. They don't concern you, but they're real, and they're sufficient. What matters is that our interests align. He paused. And I do know something about you, Duchess. I know that you've been managing the Ashworth estate single-handedly for 2 years, while your husband bleeds the accounts dry. I know that 3 of your tenants wrote to me, a stranger, asking if I might intervene, because they'd heard I was decent, and they were desperate. Your people respect you. They're afraid that if Cornelius pushes you out, they'll be left with no one who actually gives a damn about their livelihoods. The mention of the tenants cracked something in her composure. Those families. The Harlows with their leaking roof. Old Mr. Fenwick who needed the drainage fixed before another winter ruined his fields. The Colby widow, with 4 children, and a cottage that was slowly falling apart. She'd been fighting Cornelius for months to release funds for repairs he considered beneath his attention. How do I know, she said carefully, that this isn't another scheme? That you won't use this arrangement against me later? You don't. But consider your alternatives. His eyes held hers without flinching. You can continue as you are. Dignified, isolated, slowly suffocated by a man who sees your silence as permission. Or you can accept help from someone who has nothing to lose by offering it and everything to gain from your husband's discomfort. Marin looked toward the garden, where the other guests were laughing and sipping wine, oblivious to the negotiation happening behind the roses. She thought of the anonymous letter in her locked drawer. She thought of Cornelius's smile at the Bancroft ball, cold and deliberate. She thought of the house on Wren Lane, 3 streets from her own, being prepared for a woman who would eventually replace her in everything but name. If I agree, she said slowly. There are conditions. Hadrian's eyebrow lifted slightly. I'd expect nothing less. First, no deception between us. If you have ulterior motives regarding my husband, I want to know what they are. Not now, but before this arrangement progresses beyond a few public appearances. I won't be a pawn in someone else's game while trying to escape being a pawn in my husband's. Fair. Agreed. Second, nothing that compromises my position legally. I'm still married. If Cornelius decides to pursue a formal separation or worse, I need to be untouchable. Not a whisper of impropriety that could be used against me. I would never put you in that position. You have my word. And third, she turned to face him fully. When this is over, whatever this becomes, you help me secure independence. Not charity, not patronage. Real independence. My own income, my own household, my own life. I've spent 3 years being someone's property. I won't trade one cage for another, no matter how gilded. Hadrian regarded her for a long moment. The roses swayed overhead, scattering petals onto the bench between them like confetti at a celebration neither of them was having. You negotiate like a general, he said. I negotiate like a woman who's learned what happens when she doesn't. He extended his hand. It was an unusual gesture between a man and woman of their class, more suited to a business transaction than a social arrangement. But that's precisely what this was. We have a deal, Duchess. Marin looked at his outstretched hand, steady, open, waiting, and thought about all the hands she'd taken in her life. Her father's, warm and reassuring. Cornelius's at the altar, cold even then. The surgeon's, the night she'd lost the pregnancy Cornelius never knew about because he'd been in another woman's bed. She took Hadrian's hand. His grip was firm and warm and surprisingly gentle. Marin, she said. If we're going to be convincing, you should call me Marin. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. Marin, he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. Then you should call me Hadrian. And we should return to the party before someone notices we've been behind the roses long enough to start exactly the kind of rumor we're trying to avoid. She almost laughed. The sound caught in her throat, unfamiliar and unexpected, like discovering a room in her own house she'd forgotten existed. They walked back toward the garden, maintaining the precise distance propriety required. But something had shifted. The invisible weight she'd been carrying for 3 years felt fractionally lighter, not because anything had changed yet, but because for the first time, she wasn't carrying it alone. Behind them, unseen, Lady Whitford watched from her conservatory window. Teacup paused halfway to her lips and smiled the knowing smile of a woman who recognized the opening move of a very interesting game. Their first public appearance together was not a ball or a dinner. It was a bookshop. Hadrian had suggested it, and the choice revealed more about him than any conversation could. Hatchard's on Piccadilly, a Tuesday morning when the shop would be occupied by the kind of people who noticed everything and reported it faithfully to the rest of society by evening. A ballroom entrance announces, Hadrian explained, as they walked separately toward the shop, maintaining the fiction of coincidence. A bookshop whispers. Whispers travel further. He was right. When Marin entered and found the Marquis of Dunmore already browsing the philosophy section, the 4 other customers registered it immediately. When he greeted her with warm familiarity and pulled a volume from the shelf to show her a passage, 2 of those customers happened to be Lady Pemberton and her daughter, reliable conduits to every drawing room in Mayfair. Seneca, Marin said, reading the page he'd opened to. On the shortness of life. Appropriate, don't you think, for someone who's been enduring rather than living? The observation landed closer to truth than she was prepared for. She closed the book gently. You have a habit of saying precisely the thing I'm not ready to hear. Consider it a service. Your husband has spent 3 years telling you comfortable lies. The least I can do is offer uncomfortable truths. She bought the Seneca. He bought a collection of maps he probably didn't need. They left separately, but not before Lady Pemberton had observed them laughing, genuinely laughing, over something Marin couldn't even remember afterward. What she remembered was how unfamiliar the sensation felt, like using a muscle she'd forgotten she possessed. By Thursday, 3 separate people had mentioned to Marin that the Marquess of Dunmore seemed very attentive. By Friday, Cornelius's valet had reported the bookshop encounter to his master. By Saturday, Cornelius appeared at breakfast for the first time in 2 weeks. He sat across from her at the long mahogany table, buttering toast with theatrical precision. "I hear you've made a new acquaintance." Marin didn't look up from her correspondence. "I make many acquaintances. It's part of being a duchess, as you'd know if you ever performed the role of duke." The butter knife paused. She felt his gaze sharpen, felt the familiar calculation behind his eyes, assessing whether she was being defiant or simply honest. "Lord Dunmore," Cornelius said, his tone deceptively light. "Interesting choice. The man's a recluse, barely attends anything. Suddenly he's haunting bookshops with my wife." "He wasn't haunting. He was browsing. I happened to be there. If you'd like to control where I browse, you'll need to add it to the list of things you've already taken from me. Though I imagine the list is getting rather long." Cornelius set down the knife. The playful mask dropped, revealing the cold architecture underneath. "Be careful, Marin. You're not as clever as you think you are." She met his eyes then, held them with a steadiness that cost her everything but showed nothing. "And you're not as untouchable as you believe you are. Enjoy your toast." She left the breakfast room with her hands trembling inside her sleeves, but her stride was even, unhurried, the walk of a woman who had just drawn a line in the sand and dared her husband to cross it. It was the first time in 3 years she'd spoken back to him without apologizing. It would not be the last. The world Hadrian occupied was not the same world as Cornelius's, though they shared the same streets, the same clubs, and the same social calendar. Cornelius moved through society like a blade, cutting, displaying, and demanding attention. Hadrian moved through it like water, present everywhere, controlled by nothing, shaping things quietly from below the surface. Marin discovered this gradually over the following 2 weeks, as their carefully orchestrated appearances became a rhythm. A gallery opening, where he appeared at her side with 2 glasses of wine, and an observation about the painter's technique that made her forget she was performing. A charity auction, where he bid extravagantly on a watercolor she'd admired, then had it delivered to Ashworth House the next morning with a note that read simply, "For the woman who sees beauty even in difficult circumstances." Cornelius saw the painting arrive, said nothing, but something tightened behind his eyes, and that evening he dined at home for the first time in a month, watching Marin across the table with renewed and unsettling interest. She was changing, and she knew it, not because of Hadrian, or not only because of him, because the arrangement had given her something she hadn't possessed in years, a reason to look forward rather than simply endure. She began choosing her own gowns instead of wearing whatever the modiste delivered. She started attending events she wanted to attend, not just the ones duty demanded. She spoke more in company, offered opinions she'd been swallowing for years, laughed without checking first whether Cornelius was watching. Small rebellions, enormous ones. "You're different," Odette said one morning, pinning Marin's hair for a luncheon at the Countess of Aldfield's. "Your eyes, they're different." "Different how?" Odette considered, a pin between her teeth. "Awake," she said finally, like someone lit a lamp behind them. Marin studied her reflection in the glass, the same face she'd worn for 25 years. But Odette was right. Something had shifted. The careful blankness she'd cultivated as armor was softening at the edges, revealing a woman she barely recognized. A woman who might, under different circumstances, have been happy. The luncheon at Lady Aldfield's was where the ground shifted again. 40 guests, impeccable food, conversation that circled politics and gossip in equal measure. Hadrian was there. They'd planned it, seated far enough away to avoid suspicion, but close enough to exchange glances that anyone paying attention might interpret as meaningful. But someone else was paying attention too. Vivienne Lecourt. She arrived late, a calculated entrance in plum silk that drew every eye. Marin hadn't expected her. This was not the kind of event Cornelius's mistress typically attended. Her presence here meant one of two things. Either Cornelius had arranged it as provocation, or Vivienne was operating independently. Neither possibility was comforting. "Your Grace." Vivienne's voice was honey over broken glass. She approached Marin during the interlude between courses, when guests mingled in the salon. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though of course I know who you are." The audacity was breathtaking. Marin felt every eye in the room pivot toward them. A duchess and her husband's mistress, face to face in a countess's salon. The silence had a physical weight. "Miss Lecourt." Marin kept her voice level, almost warm. "I know who you are as well. Your reputation precedes you." The word reputation was precise as a scalpel, and Vivienne's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I wanted to say," Vivienne continued, pitching her voice to Carrie, "how much I admire your composure. It must be terribly difficult watching your husband find happiness elsewhere. You bear it with such grace." The cruelty was masterful, wrapped in compliment, delivered in public, designed to make Marin either crumble or lash out. Either response would serve Vivienne's purpose. Marin did neither. "Happiness is a generous word," she said, smiling as though discussing the weather. "But I appreciate your concern for my emotional state. It's touching, coming from someone in your position. One might almost call it sisterly." A ripple of shocked laughter moved through the room. Vivienne's composure cracked. Just a fracture, quickly repaired, but visible. "How charming," Vivienne murmured, and retreated. From across the salon, Hadrian caught Marin's eye. He raised his glass a fraction of an inch. Not a toast, an acknowledgement. She'd held the field, and he wanted her to know he'd seen it. But later, in the carriage home, Marin's hands shook violently enough that she had to press them between her knees. The encounter had cost more than she'd shown. Vivienne's words echoed, "Watching your husband find happiness elsewhere." And the worst part was the grain of truth buried in the cruelty. Cornelius did seem happier with Vivienne than he'd ever been with her. More relaxed, more present, more human. What did it say about Marin that her husband became a better person the moment he left her? She pushed the thought away. She couldn't afford it. Not now. But it lingered, curling like smoke in the quiet spaces of her mind, waiting. The summons arrived on a Wednesday, hand-delivered by a footman in burgundy livery that Marin recognized immediately. The Marchioness of Dunmore, Hadrian's mother, requested the Duchess of Ashworth's company for afternoon tea. At her earliest convenience, which in the language of the aristocracy meant immediately, Marin had known this was coming. Hadrian had warned her, though his warning had been characteristically understated. "My mother will want to meet you. She'll be polite. She'll also be assessing whether you're a threat to the family name, a fortune hunter, or merely insane. Try not to take it personally." Dunmore House was an imposing residence in Grosvenor Square, all Portland stone and tall windows that seemed to look down on passers-by with aristocratic disdain. A butler with the demeanor of a cathedral gargoyle escorted Marin through rooms of increasing grandeur until they reached a private sitting room on the second floor. Philippa Voss, the Marchioness of Dunmore, sat in a wing-back chair positioned precisely where the afternoon light would illuminate her without creating shadows. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair arranged with military precision, cheekbones that could have been carved by a Renaissance sculptor, and gray eyes identical to her son's, though where Hadrian's carried warmth beneath the assessment, his mother's offered no such comfort. "Sit down, Your Grace." Not an invitation, an instruction. Maren sat, arranging her skirts with practiced calm. A tea service appeared, poured and positioned by an invisible maid, who vanished the moment the last cup was placed. The Marchioness studied her, the way a jeweler studies a stone brought in by a stranger, looking for flaws, testing authenticity, calculating worth. "My son," she began, "has always had an unfortunate tendency toward noble causes. Stray dogs, bankrupt tenants, charitable ventures that consume his income without producing results. He collects broken things and believes he can mend them. It's his father's influence, God rest the man. I assure you, my lady, I'm not broken." "No." The Marchioness's eyebrow lifted. "You're a duchess trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who publicly humiliates you. Your family's fortune is spent. Your husband controls your income, your household, and your social standing. You have no children, no independent means, and no viable path to freedom under the current law. If you're not broken, Your Grace, you're performing an extraordinary imitation." Each fact landed with the force of a hammer wrapped in silk. Maren felt her composure strain but refused to let it fracture. This woman was testing her, not attacking her. There was a difference, though it was difficult to appreciate when the test involved listing every vulnerability she possessed. "Everything you've said is accurate," Maren replied, keeping her voice steady. "But you've left something out." "Have I?" "You've described my circumstances, not my character. Circumstances can change. Character is what determines whether they do." Silence settled between them. The Marchioness's expression didn't shift, but something in her posture changed. A subtle recalibration, the way a fencer adjusts when they realize their opponent is better than expected. "My son tells me nothing about his plans. He never has. But I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid. He's spending time with you in public, which means he wants to be seen with you, which means he's using your situation for a purpose that serves his own interests. What I want to know is whether you understand what those interests are. He told me he has reasons for wanting my husband diminished. He hasn't shared the details. And you accepted that? A stranger's vague promise of mutual benefit? I accepted a lifeline, my lady. When you're drowning, you don't interrogate the rope." The Marchioness's lips pressed together. Not quite a smile, not quite disapproval. She set down her teacup with the precision of someone who never made accidental gestures. "My late husband and the previous Duke of Ashworth, your husband's father, were close friends. Business partners, in fact. When the elder Ashworth died, there were outstanding financial matters between our families. Your husband inherited those obligations and promptly ignored them. Hadrian has spent 2 years attempting to resolve the situation through legal channels. Your husband's solicitors have been obstructive, dismissive, and occasionally threatening." Maren felt the pieces shifting, a picture forming she hadn't seen before. "How much does Cornelius owe your family?" "Enough that its recovery would significantly impact his ability to maintain his current lifestyle." The Marchioness paused meaningfully. "Including certain property renovations he's recently undertaken. Wren Lane." Maren's breath caught. If Hadrian could force Cornelius to settle the debt, it would drain the funds earmarked for Vivian's house. Not merely an inconvenience, a direct strike at the very project designed to humiliate her. "Does Hadrian know you're telling me this?" "Hadrian didn't want you to know. He believes you'd feel manipulated, that you'd think his interest in you was purely strategic." The Marchioness fixed Maren with those unsparing gray eyes. "Is it? You're asking me. I'm asking you what you see when you look at my son. Because I see a man who has been alone since his wife died 4 years ago. A man who buried himself in obligation and principle and refused every match I've suggested. And now, for the first time since Catalina's death, he's choosing to be in someone's company. I need to know whether the woman he's chosen deserves that. The mention of a dead wife hit Maren like a physical blow. Hadrian had said nothing about this. Not a word. She'd assumed he was a bachelor, unattached, emotionally uncomplicated. Instead, he carried his own grief, his own loss, his own carefully constructed walls. I didn't know about his wife, Maren said quietly. He wouldn't have told you. He doesn't speak of her. Not to me, not to his brother, not to anyone. She died of fever in their second year of marriage. He was at her side for 11 days, watched her fade, held her hand when she went. The Marchioness's voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened around her teacup. He hasn't held anyone's hand since, until, apparently, yours behind the rose trellis at Whitford's. Of course she knew about that. Of course someone had reported it. Nothing happened in this world without witnesses. My lady, Maren said carefully, your son and I have an arrangement, a strategic partnership designed to benefit us both. I didn't enter into it seeking romance, and I don't believe he did either. Arrangements have a way of becoming complicated when the people involved are worth caring about. The Marchioness stood, signaling the audience was ending. I won't pretend to approve of this, whatever this is. You're married, and entanglements with married women have destroyed better men than my son. But I also won't pretend I haven't seen what you've done for the Ashworth tenants, the letters you've written, the funds you've scraped together, the battles you fought with a husband who couldn't care less about the people depending on him. She moved to the window, looking out over the square. Hadrian's wife was like that. She cared about things that didn't benefit her personally. It's what drew him to her, and it's what destroyed him when she died. Because people who care that deeply are rare, and losing one is a wound that never fully closes. She turned back to Maren. If you're going to be in his life, and in whatever capacity, understand that he's already lost one woman he couldn't save. He will not survive losing another. So either be worth the risk, Your Grace, or walk away now while the damage is still minor. The words hung in the room like the last note of a requiem. I don't intend to hurt him, Maren said. No one ever does. The Marchioness rang for the butler. My footman will see you out. And Your Grace, the Seneca was a good choice. My son's taste in books is considerably better than his taste in causes. Though perhaps, she added, almost to herself, this time the cause chose him. Maren left Dunmore House with her mind racing. The afternoon light felt different now, sharper, more revealing, as if someone had pulled aside a curtain she hadn't known was there. Hadrian had a dead wife. Hadrian had a financial claim against Cornelius. Hadrian's interest in her was tangled in grief and strategy, and something else she wasn't ready to name. And his mother, terrifying, perceptive, armored in propriety, had just given her both a warning and a key. Not permission, exactly, but information. And in a world where men controlled everything, information was the only currency a woman could spend without anyone's approval. She climbed into her carriage and sat in the gathering dusk, holding the Seneca volume on her lap like a talisman. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. She was done wasting. The Cavendish ball arrived like a reckoning dressed in candlelight. It was the event Cornelius had chosen. Maren knew this because he'd told her, calmly, almost pleasantly, over breakfast, that he expected her attendance. Not requested, expected. He hadn't commanded her presence at a social event in over a year, which meant this evening carried purpose she couldn't yet see. She dressed with the focused attention of a soldier preparing for battle. Odette laced her into a gown of midnight blue velvet, the fabric so dark it appeared black until the light caught it and revealed depths of cobalt and sapphire. No jewels except her mother's cameo at her throat. a deliberate choice. She would not wear Ashworth diamonds tonight. She would not wear anything that belonged to Cornelius. "You look dangerous," Odette said, and the word felt like armor. Hadrian was already at the Cavendish estate when she arrived. She spotted him near the terrace doors, talking with Lord Cavendish about something that made them both laugh. He saw her enter. His conversation didn't falter, but his gaze followed her across the room with an intensity that anyone watching would have noticed. Several people were watching. Cornelius arrived 20 minutes later, alone. No Vivian on his arm, no mistress displayed like a trophy. He wore black evening dress with an emerald pin at his cravat, and he moved through the crowd with the easy charm that had first attracted Maren 5 years ago. Before she understood that charm and kindness were not the same thing, he approached her almost immediately. "You look well," he said, and his voice carried a warmth she hadn't heard in years. Manufactured warmth, she reminded herself. Tactical. "Thank you. Dance with me." It wasn't a question. It was spoken loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. The devoted husband, requesting a dance with his wife. Refusing would make her the villain. Accepting would give him exactly what he wanted. The appearance of a functioning marriage, performed for an audience that was desperate to believe it. She took his hand. The waltz began, and Cornelius held her correctly, firmly, with the practiced skill of a man who'd been taught to dance by the best instructors money could buy. His hand burned at her waist through the velvet. "You've been busy," he said conversationally. "Lord Dunmore seems quite taken with you. I'm told you've been seen together at galleries, bookshops, charity auctions, practically inseparable. We share interests. It's what happens when two people enjoy conversation." "Conversation?" He smiled, the way a cat smiles at something small and trapped. "Is that what they're calling it? What are you doing, Cornelius?" "Dancing with my wife. Is that not allowed?" "You haven't danced with me in 2 years. You haven't spoken to me with this much warmth in longer than that. Something's changed, and I want to know what." His grip tightened fractionally. "Perhaps I've realized I've been neglecting something valuable. Isn't that what you've wanted? My attention?" The manipulation was so smooth, so perfectly calibrated, that anyone overhearing would think he was a husband, coming to his senses. Only Maren could feel the blade beneath the silk. "I stopped wanting your attention 18 months ago," she said quietly. "You killed that particular desire quite thoroughly." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or anger. "Careful, darling. People are watching." "People are always watching. You taught me that." The waltz ended. He bowed over her hand with impeccable courtesy, holding her fingers a beat too long before releasing them. "Save the supper dance for me," he said. Another command, disguised as a request. The moment he turned away, Maren released a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside her for the entire 3 minutes. Her knees were unsteady, her pulse hammered at her wrists. Hadrian appeared at her side with a glass of water, not wine. He'd noticed. Of course he'd noticed. What did he say? "He's performing. Devoted husband, renewed interest. He wants to change the narrative before I do. Or he's genuinely threatened by my presence and trying to reclaim territory. I'm not territory." "No," his gaze held hers, steady and unblinking. "You're not." But he doesn't understand that. Men like Cornelius only value what someone else desires. The music shifted to a country dance, and they were separated by the crowd. Maren found herself pulled into conversation with Lady Cavendish and a cluster of women who peppered her with questions about the Marquis of Dunmore. Was he truly as reclusive as they said? How had they met? Was it true he'd sent her a painting? She answered with practiced ease, revealing nothing, suggesting everything. But her mind was elsewhere, tracking Cornelius across the room, watching him charm a group of MPS, watching him watch her when he thought she wasn't looking. Then she saw something that turned her blood to ice. Cornelius was speaking with Vivian. Not across the room, not in a separate corridor. Right there, in the main ballroom, in a shadowed alcove that was visible to anyone who cared to look. He was standing too close, his hand at her elbow, his mouth near her ear. Vivian's eyes found Marin across the ballroom and held. A slow, victorious smile spread across her perfect face. He'd come alone to dance with his wife. He'd brought Vivian separately to remind everyone, to remind Marin, that his attention was a performance, that the real performance was what happened in alcoves and shadows and houses 3 streets away. The cruelty was architectural, designed, load-bearing, built to collapse her. And it might have worked if Hadrian hadn't chosen that exact moment to cross the ballroom and stand beside her. "The garden," he said quietly. "Now, before you shatter in front of them." She let him guide her through the terrace doors into cool night air. The garden was lit by paper lanterns, their glow soft and golden, absurdly romantic for a moment that felt like surgery. "Breathe," Hadrian said. "Just breathe." He brought her. He danced with me. All that warmth, all that attention. And then he went straight to her. In front of everyone. In front of me. I know. Why? Why does he need to hurt me? I've given him everything. I've managed his house, protected his reputation, endured his absences. I've been the perfect wife. Why isn't that enough? Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, horrified. She did not cry. She had made that rule, and she would keep it. Because perfection doesn't threaten him, Hadrian said. Strength does, and you've become strong. He can feel you pulling away, building something that doesn't include him, and it terrifies him. Not because he loves you, because he needs to control you. There's a vast difference. She stared at the lanterns through blurred vision. Your mother told me about Catalina. The name landed between them like a stone in still water. Hadrian went very still. She shouldn't have. She told me you haven't held anyone's hand since she died. Until mine. Silence. The lanterns swayed. That's true, he said finally, his voice stripped bare. And it frightens me more than anything your husband could do. Why? Because holding your hand felt like the first honest thing I've done in 4 years. And honest things can be taken away. They stood in the lantern-lit garden, 2 people armored in loss and strategy, and Marin understood with sudden, devastating clarity that this had stopped being an arrangement. Somewhere between the bookshop and the breakfast room and the rose trellis, Hadrian Voss had become the most important person in her life, and she was still married to someone else. We should go back inside, she whispered. Yes. Neither moved. Hadrian. She said his name like it cost her something. I need you to know, whatever this is, it's real for me. I didn't plan it. I didn't want it. But it's real. His hand found hers in the darkness. His fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, deliberate. A man who had forgotten what tenderness felt like, choosing to remember. It's real for me too, he said. And that changes everything. They returned to the ballroom separately, but Marin carried the warmth of his hand like a secret flame. Inside, the dancing continued. The candles blazed, and Cornelius watched from his alcove with eyes that had turned calculating and cold. He'd seen them return from the garden. He'd counted the minutes. And across the room, Vivienne Lecourt whispered something to Lady Pemberton that made the older woman's eyes go wide. The game had just changed, and Marin didn't yet know the new rules. 3 days passed in which Marin did not see Hadrian. He sent a note, brief, careful, unsigned to anyone who might intercept it. Distance for a few days. Cornelius is watching more closely. Trust the plan. She tucked it into the locked drawer with the anonymous letter and her secret savings and tried to resume the rhythm of her life. But the rhythm had changed. Everything sounded different now, like music transposed into an unfamiliar key. The house felt emptier. The mornings felt longer. The space between events, which she'd once filled with ledgers and correspondence, and the mechanical business of running a household, now stretched like a held breath. She missed him. The realization arrived without ceremony, settling into her chest like a guest who intended to stay. She missed his voice, the way he said exactly what he meant without decoration. She missed the rare moments when his composure broke and something luminous showed through. Humor, tenderness, the shadow of a grief he carried with such careful dignity, she sometimes forgot it was there. On the third evening, Cornelius summoned her to his study. He was standing by the fireplace when she entered, brandy in hand, lit from below by the flames, in a way that made his face look carved from marble. Beautiful and merciless. "Close the door." She did, though every instinct screamed against being enclosed with him. "I've received an interesting letter," he said, turning the glass slowly. "From Lord Dunmore's solicitor. It concerns a financial obligation my father apparently left unresolved." Maren kept her expression neutral. "I'm not familiar with your father's business dealings." "No, because it seems the Marquis has decided to pursue this matter with rather sudden vigor. Funny timing, wouldn't you say? He takes an interest in my wife, and simultaneously his lawyers begin pressing a claim that sat dormant for years. Perhaps he simply hired better solicitors." Cornelius's eyes narrowed. "You know about this?" "I know that you owe debts you haven't paid. I don't need Lord Dunmore to tell me that. The household accounts are quite eloquent on the subject." He set the brandy down with a sharp click. "Let me be very clear, Maren. Whatever you think is happening between you and Dunmore, whatever fantasy you've constructed, it ends now. You are my wife. You bear my name. You live in my house. And you will not humiliate me by parading around London with a man who is actively trying to destroy me financially." "Humiliate you?" The word escaped before she could stop it, carried on a wave of fury she'd been suppressing for 3 years. "You brought your mistress to the Bancroft ball. You're building her a house 3 streets from mine. You danced with me at Cavendish and then went straight to her arms in front of 300 people. And you're lecturing me about humiliation? That's different." "How? How is it different?" "Because I'm the Duke of Ashworth." He said it with the absolute conviction of a man who believed the world existed to accommodate him. "I can do as I please. You cannot." The silence that followed was the most dangerous silence of Maren's life, not because of what Cornelius might do, but because of what she might say. Words pressed against her teeth, truths about the pregnancy he never knew about the nights she'd spent alone while he was in someone else's bed, about the slow, methodical destruction of every hope she'd carried into this marriage. She swallowed them, not out of fear, out of strategy. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I'm finished when I say I'm finished." "Then say it, because I have correspondence to attend to." She turned and walked out of his study without permission, without a curtsy, without the deference he expected from every person who occupied space in his world. Behind her, she heard the brandy glass shatter against the fireplace. In her room, she locked the door and sat on the edge of her bed, shaking. Not from fear, from the volcanic effort of containing everything she wanted to scream. Odette came, took one look at her face, and silently brought tea with brandy in it. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat on the floor beside the bed and waited until the shaking stopped. Write to him, Odette said quietly. To Lord Dunmore. Tell him what happened. I can't involve him further. It's too dangerous. It's already dangerous, ma'am. The only question is whether you face it alone or not. Marin stared at the fire. Odette was right, and the rightness of it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the only options were to jump or be pushed. She wrote the letter that night, not to Hadrian, to his mother. My lady, I write to inform you that your son's legal action has provoked a reaction. My husband is aware of the connection between us. I believe the situation is escalating in ways that may affect your family as well as mine. I thought you should know. With respect, Empsort. She sealed it and gave it to Odette for morning delivery. Then she lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of Ashworth House settling around her, the creak of old wood, the distant clatter of servants, the vast, empty silence of a marriage that had died years ago but refused to stop breathing. The Marchioness responded not with a letter, but with a carriage. It arrived at Ashworth House at 11 the following morning, bearing not Philippa Voss, but Hadrian himself. He was shown into the drawing room by a footman who clearly knew this visit would reach Cornelius's ears within the hour. Good. Let it. You wrote to my mother, Hadrian said, standing in the middle of Marin's drawing room with the rigid posture of a man barely containing his fury. You should have written to me. Your note said to keep distance. My note was strategic caution, not an invitation for you to face him alone. I face him alone every day. That's what marriage is when it's to someone like Cornelius. The words hung between them, and she watched Hadrian's anger shift, not diminish, but redirect, away from her, toward the man who wasn't in the room, but whose presence permeated every surface. What did he say to you? That I'm his property, that I'm not permitted to humiliate him, that your legal claim and your interest in me are conveniently simultaneous. He's not wrong about the timing, but he's wrong about everything else. Hadrian moved to the window, checking the street below. Habit, she realized. He was checking whether they were being observed. I should have told you about the debt from the beginning. I was afraid it would color everything, that you'd think I approached you purely for strategic advantage. Did you? He turned from the window. Initially. Yes. I won't lie about that. I saw an opportunity. Your situation and mine aligned. I thought we could help each other without complication. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a rawness she'd never heard before. But complication arrived the first time you laughed behind those roses. The sound of it broke something in me that had been frozen solid for 4 years. Marin's breath caught. She thought of what his mother had said. He hasn't held anyone's hand since Catalina died, and felt the weight of what this man was offering. Not just alliance, not just strategy. Something terrifying and fragile and real. Tell me about her, Marin said. About Catalina. Pain crossed his face like a cloud shadow. He sat down slowly, as if the act of sitting required permission he wasn't sure he'd been granted. She was Spanish. Her father was a diplomat. She laughed at everything I said, even when it wasn't funny, and she could argue philosophy in 3 languages. She planted a garden at Dunmore that still blooms every spring. She died on a Thursday morning in November while I was reading to her. Keats. She loved Keats. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. She was 24. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be here. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had seen too much loss and learned too little of how to recover from it. That's all I've wanted since the bookshop. Not strategy, not revenge, not the debt. Just you, present, real in the same room, breathing the same air, making me remember that the world contains something other than obligation and absence. Marin crossed the room. She didn't plan it. Her body moved before her mind gave permission, closing the distance between them until she stood directly in front of his chair, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his irises, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "This is the most dangerous thing either of us has ever done," she said. "I know. If Cornelius finds out, truly finds out, he will use it to destroy us both." "I know. And you still want this? Whatever this is?" He stood, and they were close now. Close enough that the wrong word or the right silence could change everything. His hand rose to her face, not touching. Hovering, the way one hovers near a flame, testing the distance between warmth and burning. Maren. Her name in his mouth sounded like something sacred. "I have been sleepwalking through my own life since Catalina died, performing duties, managing estates, existing without living. And then you sat down on a bench behind some roses and told me your conditions, as if you were negotiating a treaty. And I thought, there she is, the one who wakes me up." His fingers brushed her cheek, the lightest touch, the most consequential. She closed her eyes and let herself lean into his hand, surrendering to something she'd been fighting since the garden at the Cavendish ball. His forehead came to rest against hers, and for a moment they simply breathed together. The same air, the same space, the same impossible tenderness. When he kissed her, it was not the urgent collision she'd expected. It was slow, deliberate. The kiss of a man who understood that some things, once begun, could never be taken back, and wanted to be certain she understood it too. She kissed him back, and the world, which had been gray and careful and measured for as long as she could remember, flooded with color. When they parted, his hands were trembling. So were hers. "We can't undo this," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "We can't." The clock on the mantel chimed noon, indifferent to the fact that everything had changed. Somewhere in this house, servants were going about their duties. Somewhere in London, Cornelius was spending money he didn't have on a woman he didn't love. And here, in a drawing room full of borrowed furniture and broken promises, two people who had no right to happiness had found it anyway. "What happens now?" Maren asked. "Now, we stop pretending this is an arrangement." His thumb traced her jawline, achingly gentle. "And we start figuring out how to survive the consequences." From the hallway, the distant sound of the front door opening, Cornelius's voice, sharp and querulous, demanding to know whose carriage was blocking the street. They stepped apart. The distance felt like a wound. "Go," Maren said. "The back entrance, through the garden. I'm not afraid of him. I know. But I need to handle this my way. Please." He held her gaze for one long, agonizing moment. Then he nodded, pressed his lips to her forehead, a benediction, a promise, and disappeared through the garden door. Maren smoothed her dress, checked her reflection in the mirror above the fireplace, and walked into the hallway to meet her husband, with a face that betrayed nothing and a heart that was, at last, entirely her own. What followed was the worst week of Maren's life, and given the competition, that was significant. Cornelius didn't rage. Rage she could have handled. It was honest, at least, a visible force she could brace against. Instead, he grew quiet, attentive, solicitous in a way that made her skin crawl because it was indistinguishable from genuine care if you didn't know the machinery behind it. He began appearing at meals, asking about her day, commenting on the garden, inquiring after the tenants with manufactured concern. He canceled 2 evenings with Vivienne, or claimed to, and accompanied Maren to a dinner at Lord Hertford's, where he was charming and witty, and placed his hand on her back with the exact pressure that suggested intimacy without possession. It was the most sophisticated cruelty he'd ever deployed, because it worked. Not on Maren. She saw the strings, felt the puppet master's fingers. but on everyone else. Lady Pemberton declared the Ashworths seemed much improved. Lord Cavendish mentioned how pleasant it was to see the Duke taking an interest in his wife again. Even the servants softened, relieved that the household might be returning to some semblance of normalcy, and Marin couldn't counter it without looking like the problem. If she pulled away from Cornelius's renewed attention, she was the cold, ungrateful wife who couldn't appreciate her husband's efforts. If she continued seeing Hadrian, she was the adulteress who'd driven a good man into another woman's arms. Cornelius had rewritten the narrative, and he'd done it brilliantly. The trap closed completely on Thursday. She returned from a walk to find Cornelius in her private sitting room, a space he hadn't entered in over a year. He was holding the Seneca. "Interesting book," he said mildly. "Not your usual taste. A gift, I imagine?" "I purchased it myself." "Did you?" He opened the cover. There, on the first page, in a hand she didn't recognize, but Cornelius clearly did. For someone who has stopped enduring and started living. Trosh, she'd never noticed the inscription. Hadrian must have written it before she purchased the volume, while she was browsing the other shelves, while she thought he was simply showing her a passage, a private message she was never meant to find in front of her husband. Cornelius closed the book gently. His expression was almost kind, which made it infinitely worse than fury. "I've been patient, Marin. I've given you latitude. I've allowed your little friendship with Dunmore because I assumed it was harmless. A lonely wife seeking attention, nothing more. But inscriptions in books, whispered conversations in gardens, his carriage at our door while I'm away. This has progressed beyond what I'm willing to tolerate." "What you're willing to tolerate?" She heard the edge in her own voice. "You've kept a mistress openly for 2 years. You're building her a house. You paraded her on your arm in front of all of London. And a man giving me a book of philosophy crosses a line?" "Yes." No hesitation. No shame. "Because I'm the Duke, and because what I do has no bearing on what you're permitted to do. That may not be fair, Marin, but it's reality. And if you continue down this path, I will be forced to take measures." "What measures?" "I'll begin proceedings for a formal separation, on grounds of your misconduct." The word misconduct detonated in the silence. A formal separation on those grounds would destroy her, not just socially, legally, financially, completely. She would lose everything. The house, the tenants she'd fought for, the meager savings she'd accumulated, any shred of independence she'd built. She would be cast out with nothing, branded as the unfaithful wife, while Cornelius emerged with sympathy and Vivienne Lecourt installed permanently in her place. "There has been no misconduct," she said, and her voice was ice over a frozen lake, solid, but 1 degree from cracking. "You can allege what you like, but there is no evidence because there is nothing to find. Evidence can be arranged." He said it quietly, almost gently, the way one might explain arithmetic to a child. A word from the right servant, a letter discovered in the wrong place, a witness who happened to see something through a garden window. It doesn't need to be true, Marin. It only needs to be believed. She stared at him. This man she'd married, this man she'd tried so desperately to love, then to tolerate, then simply to survive. He would fabricate evidence. He would destroy her reputation with lies. He would do it calmly, methodically, without losing a moment's sleep. Why? The question came from somewhere deep and hollow. "Why do you hate me this much?" Something shifted in his face. For 1 fraction of a second, something almost human appeared behind the marble. Not guilt, exactly, but recognition. The fleeting awareness that he had become something monstrous. Then it vanished. "I don't hate you. I simply don't need you anymore, and I won't have you embarrassing me while I move forward with my life." He set the Seneca on the table between them and left. Maren stood motionless for a long time. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. The world continued its indifferent rotation, while everything inside her came apart. That night, she wrote 3 letters. The first to Hadrian. We must stop. He knows. He's threatened a formal separation on grounds of misconduct. I won't let him destroy you along with me. Please don't come to the house again. Please don't write. This is the only way I can protect us both. Forgive me. Mem. The second, to her mother in the country. I may need to come home soon. I'll explain when I arrive. Please don't worry. The third, she didn't send. She wrote it to herself in the small hours when the house was silent and the truth felt safe enough to put on paper. I love him. I love Hadrian Voss. I love the way he makes me feel like a person instead of a possession. I love his grief and his gentleness and the way he sees me. Not the Duchess, not the wife, but me. And I'm going to lose him because the world has decided that a woman who belongs to a cruel man has no right to be loved by a good one. She folded the letter and placed it in the locked drawer, with everything else she couldn't afford to keep but refused to throw away. Hadrian did not honor her request. 3 days after her letter, he appeared at the door of Ashworth House in broad daylight, dressed formally, and asked the butler to announce him. Not a clandestine visit. Not a note slipped through a side entrance. A full, proper, social call, the kind that would be recorded in the visitor's book and reported to Cornelius within the hour. Maren came downstairs to find him standing in the entrance hall with the rigid stillness of a man who had made an irreversible decision and was at peace with the wreckage it would cause. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "Calling on the Duchess of Ashworth. Perfectly respectable. Your butler agrees. Cornelius will learn that I came here openly, in daylight, with no attempt at concealment. Because I have nothing to hide." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Your letter broke my heart, Maren, but it also made something very clear. You're trying to protect me by sacrificing yourself, and I refuse to let that happen. You don't have a choice. I do, and I've made it." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "This is a formal demand from my solicitors for the full settlement of the debt your husband's estate owes mine. £32,000, payable within 60 days. The number staggered her. £32,000. That wasn't a financial claim. That was a siege engine aimed at the walls of Cornelius's entire world. "He can't pay that," Maren whispered, "not without selling property. I know. The Wren Lane house, for instance, would need to go, along with several other assets he's been liquidating to fund his lifestyle." Hadrian's expression was granite. "I didn't want to use this. I wanted to resolve things quietly, give him the option to settle honorably. But he threatened you, Maren. He threatened to fabricate evidence and destroy your name. There is no honorable resolution with a man like that. He'll retaliate. Let him. I've spent 4 years being careful, being measured, being responsible. Catalina died, and I became a monument to restraint. But restraint doesn't protect the people I—" He stopped, steadied himself. "The people I love." The word love dropped into the entrance hall like a stone into deep water. Maren felt it ripple through her entire body. "You can't love me," she said. "I'm married. I'm trapped. I have nothing to offer you. You offered me your hand behind a rose trellis when you had every reason to trust no one. You faced Vivienne Lecourt in a room full of people who wanted to watch you crumble, and you stood. You wrote to my mother to protect my family before you protected yourself. Do not tell me you have nothing to offer." A sound from the upper landing, a servant, perhaps, or the creak of an old house. They both looked up. "Nothing. Cornelius will be at the Hargrove Assembly tonight," Hadrian continued. "So will Vivienne. So will everyone who matters. I intend to be there. and I intend to make my position very clear. What position? That you are not alone, that you have never been alone, not since I sat down on that bench, and that any man who threatens you will answer to me publicly, legally, and in every way the law allows. Hadrian, this is reckless. No, reckless was watching you suffer for 3 years while the world looked away. This is overdue. He took her hand, deliberately, openly, in the entrance hall of her husband's house, where any servant could see. Come to the assembly tonight. Wear whatever you like. Stand wherever you choose. And when the last dance begins, look at me. That's all I ask. He left before she could argue, before she could refuse, before the rational part of her mind could construct all the reasons this was catastrophic. She stood in the entrance hall holding the legal document, feeling the phantom warmth of his grip, and realized that she had been given a choice. Safety, which was another word for slow suffocation, or courage, which was another word for everything she'd been afraid to want. She chose. At 7 that evening, Odette laced her into a gown of deep garnet silk, the color of wine, of blood, of things that couldn't be taken back. She wore her mother's cameo again, and nothing else. No Ashworth jewels, no borrowed identity, just Marin. You're certain? Odette asked, and her voice held something Marin had never heard from her before. Hope. I'm certain. She walked out the front door of Ashworth House and into the waiting carriage, and she did not look back. The Hargrove Assembly was in full blaze when Marin arrived. Hundreds of candles, hundreds of guests, an orchestra playing something bright and relentless. She paused at the top of the staircase, the same position Cornelius had occupied at the Bancroft ball when he descended with Vivian and shattered her world. But tonight, Marin descended alone, and the effect was entirely different. Heads turned, conversations faltered. The garnet gown caught the candlelight and blazed like an ember. She moved through the room with the unhurried grace of a woman who had made her peace with whatever came next, and the crowd parted for her, not out of pity, not out of scandal, but out of something closer to awe. She found Cornelius near the refreshment table with Vivian at his side, both of them watching her entrance, with expressions that suggested they hadn't expected her to come. Cornelius's jaw tightened. Vivian's smile wavered. Good. Hadrian was near the terrace doors, exactly where he'd stood at the Cavendish ball. Their eyes met across the room, and he inclined his head. A greeting? A question? A declaration. The evening unfolded with excruciating precision. Marin danced with Lord Cavendish, with Sir Harold Pemberton, with 2 young gentlemen who blushed furiously at the attention. She laughed. She conversed. She moved through the assembly like a woman who owned it. People whispered, but the whispers had changed. They were no longer pitying. They were curious. Cornelius attempted to intercept her twice. The first time she smiled and excused herself to speak with Lady Hertford. The second time she simply looked at him, a long, level gaze that carried 3 years of silence and rage and endurance. And he faltered. Actually faltered. His step hesitated. His composure cracked. And in that moment, every person watching understood that the balance of power in the Ashworth marriage had shifted irrevocably. Vivienne tried next. She approached with a glass of champagne and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Your Grace, you look remarkably well this evening. I almost didn't recognize you. How fortunate, Marin said pleasantly, that recognition isn't required for relevance. She walked away, and behind her, she heard the sharp intake of breath that meant Vivian had finally understood. She was no longer the weapon Cornelius was wielding. She was a liability he couldn't control. The evening deepened. The candles burned lower. The orchestra paused between sets, and the master of ceremonies announced the final dance. the last waltz of the evening. Maren stood at the edge of the floor. Across the room, Cornelius moved toward her. Habit, expectation, the assumption that his wife would take his hand because she always had, because that was her role, because the world expected it. He extended his hand. "Shall we?" Maren looked at his hand. Long fingers, gold signet ring, the hand that had signed away their happiness for the price of his own pleasure. The hand that had never once held hers with tenderness. The hand that had written instructions for a house 3 streets away, designed for a woman who was standing right there, watching with triumphant eyes. "No," Maren said. The word was quiet, but in the hushed ballroom, it carried like a cannon shot. Then she turned, and she walked across the floor, past the gasping guests, past the frozen servants, past Vivienne Lecourt's crumbling smile, until she reached Hadrian Voss. He was standing very still. His gray eyes were bright with something she recognized because she felt it too. Terror and hope in equal devastating measure. "Dance with me," she said. Not a question. Not a request. A choice, made publicly, irrevocably, in front of every person who had watched her endure in silence for years. Hadrian took her hand. The orchestra began to play. A waltz, slow and aching, as if even the music understood the gravity of what was happening. He placed his hand at her waist. She placed hers on his shoulder, and they moved together into the center of the floor. 2 people who had found each other through strategy and grief, and the stubborn refusal to accept that duty was a substitute for love. "Everyone is staring," she whispered. "Let them," he said. "Let them see a woman who finally chose herself." They danced. Around them, the ballroom was silent except for the music and the thundering of every heart in the room. Cornelius stood where she'd left him, his hand still extended, his face the color of ash. The Marchioness of Dunmore watched from a chair near the wall, her expression complicated, fear and pride, and the reluctant acknowledgement that her son had chosen well. When the waltz ended, Hadrian and Maren stood in the center of the floor, hands still joined, and the silence was so complete that the guttering of a candle sounded like applause. Then Lady Whitford began to clap. Slowly, deliberately, from her seat near the orchestra. Lady Cavendish joined her, then Sir Harold, then, astonishingly, the Marchioness herself, rising to her feet with the regal authority of a woman who had decided, against all her reservations, that courage deserved recognition. The applause spread through the ballroom like sunrise. Not everyone joined. Not everyone approved. Cornelius turned on his heel and left, Vivienne trailing behind him, and their departure was noted with the kind of sharp attention that would fuel gossip for weeks. But Maren didn't watch them go. She was looking at Hadrian, and he was looking at her. And for the first time in her adult life, she was standing exactly where she wanted to be. 1 year later, the separation was neither clean nor quiet. Cornelius fought it, of course. He fought everything: the financial settlement, the debt repayment, the division of property. He attempted to bring charges of misconduct, but his fabricated evidence crumbled when 3 of his own servants testified, voluntarily, to the true nature of the marriage. Old Mr. Fenwick traveled to London at his own expense to speak on the Duchess's behalf. The Colby widow wrote a letter to the judge that made the court clerk weep. In the end, Cornelius settled. He had no choice. The £32,000 demanded by the Voss family stripped him of the Wren Lane property, 2 country estates, and most of his liquidity. Vivienne Lecourt, finding her benefactor suddenly and dramatically less wealthy, departed for the continent with a minor baron who had more money and fewer complications. Maren received the independence she'd negotiated on a bench behind a rose trellis, her own household, Her own income, settled from the Ashworth estate as part of the separation. Her own life, clean and free, and entirely her own to shape. She moved into a modest townhouse in Bloomsbury that she chose herself. The wallpaper was terrible. The garden was overgrown. The neighbors were a philosophy professor and a retired opera singer who argued about Rousseau at all hours. She loved it fiercely. Hadrian visited on Wednesdays and Sundays, always properly, always announced, always with a book under his arm that he claimed she needed to read, though she suspected the books were pretexts and the visits were the point. They did not rush. They had both learned the cost of rushing, of marriages built on transactions rather than truth. Instead, they walked together in the park, argued about Seneca over tea, and allowed whatever was growing between them to grow at its own pace, watered by honesty and the patient understanding that some things are worth getting right. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, precisely 6 months after the Hargrove Assembly, Maren was cataloging her small but growing library when she found a letter tucked into the Seneca volume Hadrian had first shown her at Hatchard's. It was in his handwriting, folded carefully, dated the week after they'd met. I write this knowing you'll likely never read it, but some truths need to exist somewhere, even if only on paper. Today I met a woman who laughed as if she'd forgotten how, and the sound of it woke something in me I thought had died with Catalina. I don't know her yet. I don't know if she'll trust me. I don't know if I deserve her trust. But I know this. Whatever broken thing I've been carrying for 4 years shifted today, became lighter, became bearable. Catalina once told me that love isn't a single flame, but a series of sparks, that the fire we build with one person doesn't diminish the fire we build with another. I didn't believe her then. I was too young, too certain that love was finite and loss was permanent. I believe her now. The Duchess of Ashworth has extraordinary eyes and extraordinary courage. And I am, for the first time in years, afraid, not of loss, but of hope, which means, I think, that I'm finally alive again. Maren read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down on the floor of her imperfect, beautiful, entirely her own library, and cried, not from grief, not from pain, but from the overwhelming, terrifying, magnificent realization that she had been loved long before she knew it. When Hadrian arrived on Wednesday with a volume of Keats and an unconvincing excuse about a passage she simply had to read, she handed him the letter without a word. He read it. His face went very still. "You found it," he said. "You hid it badly. I hid it perfectly. You were simply more thorough than I expected." She took the Keats from his hands, set it on the shelf, and kissed him in her own library, in her own home, on her own terms. No performance, no arrangement, no borrowed life. Just 2 people who had earned their happiness the hard way and intended to keep earning it every day for as long as the sparks held. Outside the window, London carried on, gossiping, judging, and spinning its endless wheel of scandal and propriety. The whispers about the Duchess who chose her husband's rival for the last dance never entirely faded. They didn't need to. Maren had stopped listening to whispers the night she learned that the only voice that mattered was her own. And every year, on the anniversary of the Hargrove Assembly, she and Hadrian attended a ball. Not always the same one, not always grand, but always, when the last waltz began, she crossed the floor to him. And always, he took her hand, not because the world was watching, because they had both learned that love is not a waltz you perform for an audience. It's the one you dance when the music is almost over, and you choose, deliberately, defiantly, with your whole terrified heart, to keep moving. Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories exist, because you believe in love that refuses to be quiet, in women who choose themselves before they choose anyone else, in endings that feel earned because they were fought for, not gifted. Your presence makes this space warm and welcoming, and I'm grateful for every moment you spend with these characters. Do you have a favorite line or scene? Your engagement helps me understand what moves you, what keeps you listening, and what kinds of stories to create next. Consider subscribing if you'd like more romances with emotional depth and genuine character growth. Thank you for being here. You make this community what it is.